just the local history programs on it, and we're very excited about history. We have, actually, the Literary Festival is an all-day event. It's 10 o'clock in the morning through till 5, and then at 5 we're having a wine and cheese hour. And it's held at the library, but we have a committee who works on it year-round, pulling authors in.
It's raining.
And so we have 3 very exciting events that deal with history, and one is the Timothy Leary project. Once again, there's a book that just came out this month. This one, it's hardcover actually. A woman who received 600 boxes of Timothy Leary papers from a garage in California, and she was the archivist to pull these papers and put them together. And then she was approached by a publisher to do something with those, to write it up. And I think this book is just excellent about that. It has 2 chapters on Millbrook specifically in it. And it's very straightforward. And along with her, this is Jennifer Ulrich, along with her will be Devin Lander, who was here last month as state historian to talk about Timothy Leary. And those 2 will be in conversation for the program. So we're excited about that. Then we also have Native Voices, and you know, they're going to talk about language and ancient language. And I'm very excited that Jesse Bruchak is part of that panel this year, and he does coaching on films for dialect of various Algonquin languages, or I think expanded other ancient languages. He's been in Africa to coach on the film set, and so that's very exciting. They're going to talk about Native American words and poetry from them, and come as music, word by word. Anyway, we have that. Then also, the other woman, Jana Lays, is from the Berkshires, and she wrote a children's book, A Free Woman of God's Earth, and it's about Mombet, the slave woman, who lived in the Berkshires, in Sheffield and Stockbridge area. She sued for her freedom in 1781, can't remember. It was because of her that Massachusetts was the first state to free their slaves. And so this book was picked up by Hollywood, this children's book. And Octavia Spencer is now going to be the executive producer of that movie. She's a woman who, if anyone saw either The Help or Hidden Figures or Shape of Water, the newest one, that's her. Oh. She's the executive producer. So she's not coming. I'm sorry. The woman who wrote the book.
Are there specific times for the talks?
Oh, yes. Oh, I need to tell you this. Thank you. To find out more about the whole day, it's on our website. So you just look up Millbrook Literary Festival, and you'll see the website with all of the schedule. Well, we're getting the schedule up there. It'll soon be up there with all the program descriptions and all the authors. Their bios are listed out. So
Do you have hard copies of those at the library or other places?
Yeah, of this?
Of the schedules?
We will. Another good point. We should be getting those out soon. Yeah, and it'll be in newspapers and on the movie screens actually in Millerton and the Lyceum. We're getting ads up there. So I have 10 copies here if people are interested to read through those. You can pick them up.
Thanks, Allison. Before I turn it over to David, just one request for help. If anybody has any photographs of family members from World War I, Dutchess County Historical Society, big project this year for the 100th anniversary of the end of the war, looking for any information connected to World War I and Millbrook in any way. If anybody has any of that stuff, please talk to David, talk to Kathy, talk to me, talk to Diane. We'd love to be able to scan that stuff and preserve it. So with the County Historical Society. So often people say, like, this person needs no introduction, but that's like actually true with David, right? So,
all right, with a captive audience.
There you go.
Yes, thank you. The presentation tonight has a different focus than the presentation I did last week for Maury's Kitchen. There will be an overlap, but more importantly, the reality is that every single one of us, every one of us, has a connection with World War I, the Great War. We may not realize it. We may not have asked the questions when we were young, or we may not have understood what the connection may be, but we all are impacted by World War I. For some of us, relatives may have fought in the war. For some of us, family members may have been casualties of the war. In other situations, you may have been doing something at home for the war effort. In others, things like the Red Cross became hugely important. The YMCA, the YWCA, these were organizations that were really important. But here's another connection, and that is, you'll see it in a moment, but our president, Wilson, was, as the war was beginning to happen in Europe, Wilson's difficulty was to try to maintain a neutrality here, because most Americans didn't want to have anything to do with the war effort. I mentioned this last week for two main reasons. The largest immigrant populations that we had in 1914, 1913 were Irish, who wanted nothing to do with England, absolutely nothing, emphatically, and also German and Austrian connections. So there was a real tendency to step back and say, it's not our war, it's their war. That began to change with the Lusitania. And some of you know about the story of that, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. The one group, though, that was desperate to be involved with the war effort, desperate, because they were stranded here and couldn't get back to help their cousins and brothers and family members, was which country? Italy. Italy was desperate to be involved with it, because Italy was in a curious position. Italy has always had a problem with Austria and with Germany, and where exactly the borders were of those countries, and who owned which pass. So lots of problems. Italy resolved that, technically, by being part of the three-country consortium, and that was Italy, Austria, and Germany. So technically, Italy was part of that effort. But they didn't want to be involved with the war because of what was happening at their borders. So they made the equivalent of a silent agreement to work with the Allied forces. So they stepped back from the war effort. And in point of fact, they fought against the Germans and the Austrians. And that's a whole story that you'll hear in just a few minutes. So let's go on. Thank you. Next slide. When we think of the war, we think of photographs that have been published in a variety of sources, and there are lots of great resources. This happens to be one that is the Imperial War Museum. That's the equivalent of the National Museum in Britain that documented the war proper, and the resources for that are extraordinary. But the one that I love is the next one, The Faces of the War. This is from the viewpoint of the individuals, the sacrifices they made, the hardships that they made, and all of this is documented too. And the reason for that is Eastman, the Eastman family. Now, what did the Eastman family invent? Cameras. This was the war that virtually every soldier had a Brownie or had a camera that they could take pictures with and document. So many of those pictures came home. And I ask you, how many of you have pictures from World War I that may have been taken by relatives? 1, 2. Look around. What happened to those pictures? Well, what happened was each generation picks up a picture. There's no name on the back. And they very quickly, who is that? I don't know. And your children and your grandchildren throw them out because they don't mean anything. So the historian in me is, while you have an opportunity, write the names and the dates, if you know them, on the back of your pictures. Your school pictures, your marriage pictures, your vacation pictures, the first house that you had, even your pets, things that you take for granted. Help preserve them for future generations, because that's what is so important. And that's what the archives is all about. We're constantly looking for photographs and images and letters and correspondence. We ended up getting a box of correspondence from the Civil War. No one in the family, in that particular family, wanted that because they moved out of the area, documenting events. So let me show you my context. Next. You may not see a resemblance, but this is my grandfather's brother, Ross Allen Greenwood. Now, is he from here? No. He's actually from Painesville, Ohio. And he was trained as a veterinarian. And he and his wife, Barbara Morgan. Now, Morgan, anyone know what nationality that is?
German.
No. Welsh. Morgan is Welsh. And she was a Welsh family member. And she also had resistance to the English because of the political elements from her youth. But she married a Greenwood. Now, can you guess where the name Greenwood came from? England. But it was okay. He was 4, 5, 6 generations later. So he qualified as an American, not as a Brit. Anyway, this is his wife and his 2 children. And he's wearing his World War I uniform. Next.
Oh, you should mention Morgan's phone.
Catherine.
No, Morgan's phone.
Morgan. Oh, Morgan?
Yeah,
Okay, prompt me.
just if you go back one. I just wanted to point out, as just a little tidbit of information, we were just out in Tulsa, Oklahoma last month to celebrate the 100th birthday of this person. Not him, but his wife. His wife, he has died, but his wife was celebrating her 100th anniversary, still mentally and physically alert.
Absolutely, 200
And we
people,
were-
she knew every name, every syllable.
I just thought you'd like that.
Next. Now, Morgan, the dad, Ross, was a veterinarian. And when you think about World War I, the number of horses that were involved on the front that had to be maintained and cared for. I did some statistics for you. So basically, just to let you know, this was fascinating. The number of horses. Ross became the regiment vet, and he had 14 veterinarians working for him as lieutenants. And he was in charge of maintaining that force of horses. And the numbers, I just have to tell you this because it's extraordinary. Okay. There were, in his regiment, which was a fairly large group, 6,000 horses. 6,000. And that's 14 vets are responsible to maintain 6,000 of them. And there was such a desperate need because so many of them were being wiped out. By what, can you guess?
Yes.
Mustard gas. And having to have the equipment, not to mention the soldiers with it. And what was happening, Americans were desperate for more horses to pull the equipment. They were paying between $400 and $600 for each horse that they could get. Think of that investment, extraordinary the amount of money. And every bomb, here you have the horse in a rut, they're trying desperately to get the horse out. So many horses were killed, so many were blinded. And one of the things that Ross was responsible for was if he could possibly stabilize the horse so it could continue to be used, and if not, he had butchers working for him as well. Why? Because if the horse was going to die, they needed the meat. The reality of that war effort is extraordinary. Now, we were fortunate because he wrote to his family, and we've got letters describing what the events were, where he was. The Second Battle of the Marne was one that he was in. As a matter of fact, if you haven't been to the archives at the Historical Society, we currently have a display case with items, World War I items in it. And I'll be pointing out one of the things that's in that display case in a minute. Next. You recognize these.
Oh, shell cases.
These are the shell cases. And what my great uncle did was bring back one of those shell cases that had been carved with the battle that he was involved with and gave it to his brother, my grandfather, as a memento. And that is one of the items that's in the display case. Kevin DeMartine had others that ended up being local in families that had been brought from World War I, given to local families, and descendants in the families didn't want them. They didn't even know what they were. Kevin ended up picking them up. When I went to Kevin's, he said, "Dave, look what I've got." And these were items that had been in your families that at some point people got rid of because they didn't realize what the connection was. Now, who made those shell cases into urns and pots? These were the people who were desperate in the area. That's the one thing they could do. And to sell them or trade them for food with the soldiers. So every single shell has a story from it, documenting an event, but also the calamity of war and the people who were in the midst of all of it. Next. Now, when did the war begin? The war began in July of 1914. That's the Great War. When did we get involved with it? We talked about this last week. April 6th, 1917. So 1914, 1917. That was because of Wilson and the reluctance to get involved. That did change because of the bombing of ships. And when we did decide to vote, when we did vote, the House and Congress voted on becoming a part of it in April. By May, our first legions are going out. But we had a very small army, and they hadn't been trained. So this is a postcard from the time. These are our young men training to be soldiers. And do you know where they're training? In Texas. So training to get as much training as possible and then going out. We were sending from May of 1917 right through September of 1918. We were sending 10,000 soldiers a day.
Wow.
10,000 soldiers a day. And France was overjoyed to have the reinforcements because they had been decimated. But the one thing that was true at the time is we were segregated. So if you were black, you couldn't fight in the American army. You could cook and have whatever the second grade was. But we had a huge number of African American Americans enlist. And where did they go? Right to the French legions. So our black population worked with the French forces. And there's a whole story and a whole history of that that we'll be talking about at another meeting. So another postcard, next, shows the arrival of the Americans landing in France. Ship after ship after ship. And the photographs of them are extraordinary. The sheer volume of people. Next. Now, you've got the soldiers going, people leaving from Alden Place because we joined the war effort, and our enlistment, our Italian-American boys from the area, many of them enlisted because they wanted to get back to help their families and relatives in Italy. The connections were profound. We've got many stories of that. But who was left at home? By and large, the wives and the daughters and the sisters. And that's what this is all about. This is what God gives us. What are you giving so that others may live? eat less wheat, meat, fats, and sugar. Send more to Europe, or they will starve.
No.
So here we have something, you know the name, Victory Gardens. And every family had a garden and had produce. If you were a large farm, you would do the grains and wheats. And many of the DeFazio, do we have any DeFazios here? DeFazio was the Italian baker who made bread on Alden Place. And very quickly, as the family prospered, moved to Franklin Avenue. The bread that was being made here was shipped and sent off to Europe. The Italian families, and this is Catherine Rotuno, and the Rotuno sisters told me this. The families on Alden Place had very small pockets of property, so they couldn't have large gardens. But what happened with the Millbrook Land and Improvement Company, think of the Bank of Millbrook, they had lots of parcels available, and they made the possibility, if anyone wanted a victory garden, they would let you put it on the property that the bank controlled. And guess what? Virtually every Italian family on Alden took advantage of that. And all over the village, there were victory gardens. And whatever extra produce was being made was given to the armed forces and shipped over. So the network was amazing. Charlotte and her sisters remembered those because they were working in those victory gardens and remembered the kinds of things that were sent to it. But at home, the effort was, don't waste food. And one of the things I recommended was eat fish, because fish have their own food supply. You follow? You don't have to feed fish to eat them. So the number of people who were fishing in the Hudson, in the lakes here, trout, and everything else. Sunnies. Who eats a sunny? Everyone did, because the fish was an opportunity to avoid the beef and meat products could go off to Europe. Next. And here's another one. Food will win the war. You came here seeking freedom. You must now help to preserve it. Wheat is needed for the Allies. Waste nothing. Do you understand the significance of that? For everyone, the economy of saving food for the war effort where it was needed. Now, what language is this? In English. Next. What about this? Italian. That same poster was published in several different languages all over. And this happens to be one that was here in Millbrook. So the Italian families would be able to look at that and be reminded to save the food. It's exactly the same thing that was in English about saving food and sending it off. And look at the picture. Doesn't she look Italian? And where is it? Statue of Liberty and everything that it represents. So that kind of element was universal. And the victory gardens were so incredibly important. And where was the food going that was collected? Next. Oh, and this is Charlotte. Now, many of you remember Charlotte's story. Charlotte and her mom. But Charlotte, in 1995, I sat down with Charlotte, and she told me all the stories about their victory garden, where it was located, how it was set up, the kinds of food, the food that was connected, the sauce that her mom made, tomato sauce, that was then shipped over to Europe. You can imagine taking tomato sauce from here and taking it off to France. They did, huge amounts. Next. And where is this? Chow time. And it's the soldiers actually eating the food that was being sent to them. And food was such a premium because in the war areas, if they weren't given food, chances are there was nothing else available. So the soldiers depended on it. And these came in metal tins that could feed 20 soldiers a day from that one tin with the things that were in it. That's the way they were rationed. And this is just one of many photographs showing them eating in the trenches. Meanwhile, of course, bullets are flying over the top of them. Next. They shall not pass. Image after image after image. We talked about their eating. Think of the number of people, the casualties. that were in the war effort. And with my ancestor as a veterinarian trying to take care of the horses, but think of all the soldiers, sheer numbers of them. And I wanted to not stress those images, but they're haunting. The books document extraordinary images. Next. Like this. Can you tell what's happening? A soldier. What's he doing? He's taking the food out of the backpack of this soldier who's died. The reality of that. And look at that landscape. That's all over France, all over Italy. Extraordinary, the images and the destruction. Next. But there's also positive images too. This is a German town that the Allies have conquered. And the first thing they did was take down the German street name. And what have they put up? Wilson. Wilson, USA. So it's again labeling the war effort, the them and us, the battles that are involved with it. Next. And of course, the casualties, the sheer number of them. And I've got those statistics for you too. In the war, World War I, 50,000 Americans died. 50,000. What about Italy? 400,000. And the statistics for the other countries made our 50,000 insignificant by comparison. But what you don't see in that, the number of soldiers who were blinded, lost limbs, arms, and legs, who came back, some of them with breakdowns that were beyond belief. And what that did to the population in America of the 1920s was we were decimated because we didn't have the workforce that would have been associated. Now imagine in Italy what it was like. Imagine in France what it was like. Imagine in Germany what it was like. The sheer number is extraordinary. And 3 times, this is, so 50,000 Americans, 3 times that amount were wounded and maimed or blinded. So relatives, your relatives, would, if they weren't part of that statistic, would have known that. And for many of you, the nurses and the situations who took care of that were here. That's the reality of it. Next. And these are some of the images that were part of the publicity. Our daddy is fighting at the front for you. Back him up. Buy a United States government bond, the second Liberty loan. Remember the Liberty bonds? Some of us may be of an age. That's where money was going to the government to help underwrite the costs and the expenses, to provide the support network that was there. Years ago, I was able to come across a stack of World War I posters, and they were extraordinary. We had most of them framed in our previous house. But when we bought the house in Millbrook, we needed for the down payment to be able to pay for it. So Cal Smith, many of you know Cal Smith, the auction house, and we took all of those posters and a number of other items that we had, and we were able, and they were sold at the auction, we were able to cover the down payment on our house. So would I love to have those posters now? Posters house, posters house. I think we made the right decision. Next one. Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? What do you think he did? Nothing. He didn't enlist. So the whole guilt issue of that, if you fought for the effort or not, and the demographics of it, pretty amazing. Next. But we had a number in Millbrook who did. This is a pretty famous photograph. We're going to be using it as a basis later on for when we do a World War I presentation. But it happens to be at Grace. And these are all soldiers who fought the different branches. And the Red Cross, the parades, we have a whole series of photographs on going down Franklin Avenue, celebrating at the end of the war the soldiers who came back for it. So that's really documented beautifully. Some of you may have relatives who are in these pictures. Next.
Oh, in the second row there.
Yes.
There are sailors with white hats, and then over here on the right, there's someone with a sailor suit, but it's a flat, dark hat in the second row.
Second row,
Second row.
third from the end.
Second row up. Second row up. Yeah.
Third from the right.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Right there, right there.
Okay. I don't pretend to know the designations for the uniform outfits. Does anyone know?
It's a standard hat.
Standard.
The blue and the white.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? We've got a resource here.
The blue,
Civilian gloves, right?
the blue sometimes had the name of the ship they were on, and they had to eliminate that because that gave away secrets.
Okay, thank you. And we do have some people who are not in uniform because they didn't have the uniform at the time, who knows why. And they gained weight, lost weight, but they're all part of recognizing the soldiers in our area. Next. Now, Alden Place, and the different houses. We spoke last week about Alden and the restaurant, Manzy's or Grape Shade. But almost every house here had a connection. And I give my livery, but I went through our documentation with the maps, and these are the names. And most of them you would know. Okay, in 1928, these were the families, among the families on the street. And some of you may well be related to them. But these are the Italian families that were specifically on Alden Place. Seppi, Martini, DeFazio, Cardinale, Mazzaroni, Magiacomo, Panozzo, and some of you remember that from the food store that was at the corner. Originally, Manzi had a food store in front of their, what became their bar. But when this one opened up, they closed that. But here are more names. Our honorary Italian family, the Willis family, the Nardones, the Manzis, the Fioris, and then Charlotte remembered these names. The Fazio, Aridi, Martini, Magiacomo, Belletri, Panicella, Nardone, Malella, and Safari. So these are all the names that were associated with that World War I period. And how many of them are still in our community? And how many of you, by and large, if you're related to one of those names, you're related to several of them, because the very nature of that community. And that's why I'm so interested in helping to track down photographs of those families and the war effort, because so many of them did fight in World War I and went off and came back and shared their stories. Next. You recognize these, of course. This was only yesterday. We did a presentation on the Italian communities and the stories that people shared. So here you've got Tess, Charlotte, and Catherine Ritunos. And it's their stories, when I sat down with them, that they shared with me about those victory gardens, about the boys going off in uniform, and jumping at the opportunity of being able to serve in World War I because of the family connections and relatives that they had, and the uniforms. Twinkling of an eye, they're gone, but their stories aren't. They took the time to help share those stories with us. So I'm asking each of you to do the same thing. Talk to your family members. Now, World War I may seem like a million years ago, but guess what? There's World War II. Guess what? There's the Korean War. Guess what? There's the Vietnam War. Every family has a story that needs to be saved and told and shared for future generations. Next. Wonderful photograph on Olden Place, the DeFazio Bakery. When the bakery moved, the DeFazio building ended up becoming the Italian Society. It was at one point called the Benvenuto Mussolini Society, but that's something we won't stress right now. But these are the men who had their billiard and pool tables down below. And these are the men that sat outside in the summer under the grape arbor. The grape arbor. That's what caused the Manzi family to use the name Grape Shade, because they were directly across the street because of that arbor. It was a place where the men would get together. And I must admit, when I did the presentation last week, a number of the people who came to it, who knew the restaurant, and said, my mother and father said, don't you ever go there. So it had a reputation, but it's what we all share. And we've got most of the names of these people, by the way, that we've documented from them. Next. And this was the poster that I really love. So Nan, read the names again for us. Thank you.
Let's make to the test here. I can't pronounce it well. So obviously, Americans all, Dubois, Smith, O'Brien, Sejka, Hauk, Papandreopoulos, Andrassy, Viloto, Levy, Turovich, Kowalski, Krzyzanowicz, Knudsen, and Gonzalez. Americans all.
So it's celebrating the reality of everyone coming together and working together as a country, as a nation, to protect our country and the future of the country. Next. And that's it. So this is a fast overview, looking at the war effort, and so on. So if we put the lights on, I just have some other things too. Thank you. What was Italy doing during this period? Well, Italy declares war on Austria on May 23rd, 1915. They had been part of that Triple Alliance that I mentioned, but they had a secret treaty with the Allied forces to be able to work with us. And their rallying call was Sacro Egoismo, and working together for the sake of the country. March 1916, the Austrian offensive in Trentino, and Italy had been totally overwhelmed with that, the German forces coming down. And I spent my junior year in college in Siena, Italy. And the family I stayed with, local family, the Gatti family, the cat family, Gatti. And the mother was really very nice, but she said, Tedeschi? And I said, no, I'm not German, I'm American. And she was so relieved because of the war efforts and the images that she had. And the grandmother told me what the mother couldn't tell me, and that is, at the end of World War II, when everything was falling apart, and the Germans were desperate to get back up over the Alps to get into Germany, and they were desperate for food. The Italian families had buried food to preserve it, because otherwise they would have had nothing to eat. And two young German men, the Italian men were all while fighting. The two young German men broke into their very modest farmhouse and demanded food. And their grandmother said, no, no, we don't have any food, we don't have any food. And those two boys took the baby, the grandchild, from the mother and held the baby and threatened to kill the baby if they didn't give them food. So the grandmother dug up the food and gave them the food. The one man took the food, the other threw the baby up in the air and bayonet right through the baby and dropped it at the feet, and they took off. The horrors of war that could impact everyone. And I'm not justifying it or condemning it. I'm saying it's the reality on all sides of war and the war effort. Just like that young soldier taking food out of the backpack of the dead man. The first time I saw that picture, I thought he was trying to get that man up. And Nan said, no, he's not. He's trying to get the food out of the backpack. And looking at it, that's the reality of it. And some of the other names that we may have, but October 24th of 1917, it was the Battle of Caporetto. And this was a disastrous war. The Germans won and slaughtered all the soldiers, the Italian soldiers in it. 1 year later, on the exact same date, the Italians, many of them had come up from Sicily and the south, and anyone who knows the politics of Italy, you have fragmented elements. So for someone from Sicily in the south to be helping someone in Tuscany in the north, well, that's a whole other story happening. But so many Italians from other parts of Italy came up to be part of that battle. And on October 24th, 1918, the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, they slaughtered, wiped out the German forces. Wiped them out 1 year to the day that the Germans had done it to the Italians. And it was so overwhelming that basically the Germans surrendered and declared in Italy the armistice on November 3rd because of it, those war efforts. The reality of war and the impact of war is extraordinary. The other element that I mentioned last week, and some of you know the movie, many of you know the songs, but George M. Cohan. And George M. Cohan was a vaudeville dancer, singer, and wrote an incredible number of songs that was hugely popular. The ones that are most common today that we know we still sing, Over There, send the word over there. Give My Regards to Broadway, that's another famous one. You're a Grand Old Flag, and many of you know that too. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of them. Well, he ended up dying in 1942. We're in the war, the Second World War. And what Hollywood ended up doing was hiring James Cagney, who lived for a while just down the road, to be the star in the Yankee Doodle Dandy. And that movie was rushed to come out the same year that Cohen had died, 1942. So for those of you who remember the movie, I encourage you, if you don't know it, you can track it down online. But it's an extraordinary testament to patriotism and what that war effort was like. And Cohen, and this is another aspect you'll appreciate. In 1942, when that movie came out, it was stressed that that's C-O-H-A-N, not C-O-H-E-N. Do you understand why? And that's the politics, that division again, of Jewish or Irish. And what particular group do you identify with? And what World War II ended up doing is bringing all of those groups together, all of them. And the obvious is what America gave to Europe in World War II was the security and the strength and the leadership position that dominated Europe right up until yesterday. So that's my presentation on it. Hopefully it will get you thinking and going home and looking at your photographs to make sure you write them down. And share stories, the stories that you have. From the kinds of food that your family may have eaten or grown and put together, to the soldiers who came back, that lived in your community, those who were maimed or otherwise handicapped, that became part of our community, and also the great stories that were shared by families. So do your best. Sign, write the names on those photographs, and make sure your family knows where they are. Any other questions? Well, thank you, Robert, thank you. And that's it for the evening, man. We've got refreshments courtesy of the Historical Society.